Roger-Mark De Souza is Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He joins us today to discuss the Paris Climate Agreement. Roger, Mark, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Now, I was just reminding you before we began recording that when the agreement was first agreed to, you were among a lot of people working in your field who were pretty happy about what had happened and were optimistic about what it meant. How are you feeling now? How has it progressed?
I think it's good to reflect back on that moment. You know, it was such a landmark agreement. It set a global accord that today close to 200 signatories are saying we want to embrace this vision for decarbonization. And most countries have signed on. 147 countries have ratified the agreement. So the agreement is moving forward. And what's exciting about the agreement is that it allows each country to determine for themselves through national pledges which action they will take. So countries determine an individual pathway to decarbonization, and they are able to review that every 5 years. So overall, the agreement remains solid. It's widely embraced. It's moving forward.
Well, Rex Tillerson signed this a statement at the Arctic Council. Tell us about that.
And that's interesting because, as you know, he hosted the Arctic Council meeting where repeatedly he heard from leaders in the Arctic saying climate change matters. Climate change we must think about it, we must address it, we must figure out what it means for us. So there's an increasing recognition coming out of some sectors of the White House that climate change matters and we need to pay attention to it. And that message is being sent forward.
But that statement by the Arctic ministers is a non-committal statement. It was just a statement of principle. I'm sorry.
That's correct. Yeah. It's recognizing the centrality of climate change impacts.
The unpredictability of things. Here's Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, that has spent decades denying climate science. Now seems to be one of the voices in the administration who is pushing hardest that the U.S. remain in the agreement.
And it's quite interesting because from the business side, and this includes ExxonMobil and a number of other oil companies, there's been more than 600 businesses and investors who have urged President Trump to remain in the agreement. And that is a recognition that there's an upsurge of renewable energy jobs. More than 800,000 jobs were provided last year from the renewable energy sector, and that climate impacts are disrupting business operations. So there's a real sense that if we want to have jobs for Americans, that we need to be thinking about what decarbonization means and the benefits that it provides.
That's a really interesting follow the money trail aspect to this, where businesses are going to go where the growth is.
Exactly.
What happens if the U.S. pulls out? Let's look at the worst case scenario from the perspective of those who support the deal.
If the U.S. pulls out, where we should say, can the U.S. pull out, and what would that mean? So there are few approaches. Number one, if the United States wanted to pull out of the Paris Agreement, that would take 4 years. So it can pull out of the agreement, but over a 4-year period, it's required through international law to meet its commitments to decarbonize by 26 to 28% by 2015 compared to 2005 levels. So to reduce carbon emissions. The second option is to find a way to fast track coming out of the Paris Agreement. And the way to do that is to withdraw from the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And if we were able to do that, we might be able to pull out of the Paris Agreement in a year. And then the third option is to really just do nothing, to monitor the negotiations, but not take action to reduce the emissions that we've been committed to.
Not withdraw, but not sign on.
Not withdraw, not sign on, observe, and see what's happening.
Would it, Brexit survived, I mean, the EU survived the Brexit.
Yes.
Some thought it may not survive a Frexit if that happened, but now it won't happen. Does the agreement move on with or without the United States?
The agreement does move on with or without the United States, and this is quite significant because I think in terms of our U.S. national interest, it carries implications geopolitically. What we are seeing is that China potentially would step in as a climate leader, and others have claimed that indeed China will be a climate stabilizer, stabilizing relations in terms of climate negotiations. And this potentially can spill over into other areas of diplomacy and collaboration. So from a geopolitical, diplomatic perspective, it's quite important. It's also important from a security perspective. We at the Wilson Center very often talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, leading to destabilization, displacement of people, threatening military installations and operations, and having a greater call for humanitarian assistance from the United States. So there are implications for jobs, for stability, security, and in terms of diplomacy and geopolitics. Just one final point, very interestingly, and this I think came out of the Arctic Council meeting, we're also seeing more and more Americans calling for engagement to remain in the climate agreement. So a recent poll coming out of George Mason University noted that 7 out of 10 Americans want us to remain in the agreement and be thinking about how climate change, addressing climate change, can be beneficial to us in the United States.
So at least in U.S. public opinion, a tipping point has occurred.
I think so, yes. And I think that's interesting to see what the Trump administration will do as a result. They have agreed to defer any final decision until after the G7 summit, which will occur towards the end of this month.
Speaking of China's potentially filling a void left by a lack of U.S. leadership, what can you tell us about this upcoming EU-China summit on climate?
I think they will be looking at what it means in terms of how China was very much involved in leading up to the Paris Agreement. It really took a leadership role. And I think once again, in the context of the European Union, China will be looking to reaffirm its position and thinking about how it can continue to collaborate and engage the European Union as it moves forward with the climate agreement and beyond.
How soon will the science be able to measure whether or not the agreement is having an impact?
Well, I think this is interesting. This is part of what we have as a component of the agreement, that every 5 years there's a global stock taking of how countries are doing, the degree to which the action they are taking represents their specific individual realities and how much of a difference it is really making. So countries are able to adapt differently according to their local conditions. So the science allows us to think about what that means in terms of the different impacts that will occur. So this is going to occur, this review will occur in 5-year increments as the agreement moves forward.
One final thought, and it's optional, because I know we don't specialize at the Wilson Center in speculation.
Sure.
But what does your gut tell you about what the U.S. posture will be? What do you expect to happen?
I think it's important for us overall to recognize that engaging in climate change mitigation and adaptation is important to our strategic interests in terms of jobs, security, diplomacy, and it's what the American public wants. So if we look at it from that lens, it means that we must be deliberate, purposeful, and think about how addressing climate change is in our benefit. And I think ultimately it's something that we will have to be looking at very closely. So all eyes are on this, leading to the G7 meeting summit and beyond. No, not too long.
But Roger-Mark, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.